CNN invited on a forensic psychologist, or I should say forensic psychiatrist, to talk about the murder of the two police officers in New York City. Now, understand, a forensic psychiatrist means what? It means that he's a psychiatrist that works with the authorities. He works with law enforcement. So you're about to see his incredible bias come through here. He's covering this in the veil of respectability and expertise, but you'll be able to sniff out this bias. He's going to slam the entire peace movement because of the actions of one person. Let's watch.
I think that what's most remarkable about the Brooklyn gunman is that while you see many, many, many arrests and a history of violence and even an experience where his family was frightened of him, by the time one goes through the system that many times, you're definitely going to see a psychiatrist. And if you don't have, with that colorful history, an experience of significant hospitalization, well, then you have a lot of psychiatrists who are concluding that you have antisocial personality or you have drug problems, but not the kind of psychotic drive that we speak of when we find an irrational crime.
Okay, so you're drawing a distinction. I just want to make sure between antisocial behavior or substance abuse and mental illness. There are two different things. He might have had the first, but not the second.
Yes, and from a standpoint of us as a public looking at it, there are crimes in which a person is playing to his own idea, an irrational idea that nobody shares. And there's a crime like Brooklyn and like Sydney where someone plays to a constituency that thinks exactly as he does, whether we choose to admit it or not. He was from Maryland. He didn't carry out his crime in Maryland. He came to New York. He didn't carry out his crime as soon as he came to New York. He went to an area where there is established tension between the police department and local residents and said, watch what I'm going to do. He was using social media to brag about what he was going to do. And then after he did it, there were some local residents who were clapping and laughing in the aftermath. And the parallel between that and a Sydney offender is this is not a person who was isolated as the government would suggest. He had 14,000 followers on Facebook. So he had a constituency. He was a peace activist. There are some peace activists who experience an entitlement to violence.
Peace activists think they have an entitlement to violence. That's what he just said. Peace activists think they have an entitlement to violence. Peace activists think they have an entitlement to violence. There's a reason why I'm saying this so many times. I hope you're catching on to it. Do I even need to bring it up? That's a self-contradictory statement. If you're a peace activist, you're advocating for peace. You're not advocating for violence. In fact, you're protesting violence. So do you notice what he's trying to do there? It's very sneaky and it's very clever. He's trying to blame the entire peace movement for the actions of one crazy person, and he even goes as far as to say that this guy is not a single loner crazy person. This guy's connected to a movement. Now, what he's saying is demonstrably not true. We know it's not true. How do we know it's not true? Well, if this guy was part of a movement where all of us are supporting him doing it, then why has there been only his example of attacks on cops since the Mike Brown situation and since the Eric Garner situation? This guy makes it, well, all these peace activists support violence, and that's why none of them are doing it, and only this one loner crazy person did it. He's clearly trying to smear the entire movement and do the old school generalization model, where you try to say they tried to do the same thing during the civil rights protests in the 1960s. They said, oh, look, there's some people who broke glasses, windows for small businesses, and they started fires, and they did the same thing in Ferguson recently. Some fires were started, there was some rioting. So then the media tries to paint the entire movement as violent, even though a majority, 10% of the movement was violent, and in the case of the civil rights protesters, even lower. In the case of most protests around the country outside of Ferguson, much, much lower, probably about 1%, if that. I mean, and also, by the way, let's not forget that in a lot of these protests, there are undercover officers who are put into the movements as agitators. Now, if I heard somebody saying this a year ago, I wouldn't have believed it. I would have said, no, that's not true. That's a conspiracy theory. It's an Alex Jones way of thinking, and it's false. It turns out it is true. And we know this from the recent example in Oakland. There was an Oakland police officer who was marching with a bunch of peaceful protesters, and he was uncovered as being an undercover agent, and so he pulled his gun out and pointed it at people and got into a fight with one of them. And this happens, apparently, at a lot of protests all around the country. So what he's doing is nefarious, because he's trying to smear an entire movement of people who just want justice, and he's trying to say that if you call for justice, if you call for peace, what you really want is the opposite. What you really want is injustice. What you really want is not peace. You want violence. He said it. I'll go back to it again. He said peaceful protesters feel like they have an entitlement to violence. Wrong. That's totally wrong. One person did these acts. He's responsible for his own actions. It's nobody else. It's nobody else but him. And to say that he's not crazy, that he had a rational motive and he was representing this group of people. Really? So are you sure about that? So let's go through the facts on Ishmael Brinsley. He was arrested 19 times in his life. 19 times. And remember, the things that he was arrested for, it varies, it ranges. We discussed it yesterday. Things like assault to robbery. Does it sound like this guy is standing up for civil rights of people? Does he sound like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Spare me. When Martin Luther King Jr. got arrested, it was because he was protesting. This guy got arrested for robbery and other acts of violence. In fact, along with his 19 arrests, the same day that he murdered those 2 police officers in cold blood, he shot his girlfriend. Tell me again how this guy's purely politically motivated and he's a rational actor and he's representing a movement. Tell me again. And why is it that if he's representing a peace movement, that everybody that's part of that peace movement after the fact has come out and denounced it unconditionally? Talking about all of the liberal/progressive outlets online, all of the so-called leaders of the progressive movement, whether you're talking about Bill de Blasio, whether you're talking about big-time political figures like President Obama or Al Sharpton, all of them condemned violence against the police before the attack and after the attack. But what he's trying to do, again, is connect people who are calling for peace, trying to say that they're actually violent, and because this one guy did it, we're going to say they're all violent. And remember, if to say that he's not crazy, because he's saying that. No, he's rational, supporting his group of people. This is planned. No, he tried to kill himself. He tried to commit suicide in his life. That person is genuinely mentally unstable. That person's unbalanced. That person has psychological problems, deep-rooted psychological problems. So when he posts that, I'm going to go kill cops for Mike Brown and Eric Garner, and by the way, he spelt Eric Garner's wrong in the fucking post, which would be a hint that this guy's not a genius. When he's saying that, it's a cover-up. It's a cover-up. He wants to go out in a blaze of glory, and he wants to be remembered in a positive way, so he takes these insane, lunatic, violent feelings that he has, and he masks them in a veil of being a martyr for a cause. And this guy fell for it, and he's falling for it willingly because he wants to use this to besmirch the rest of the peaceful protesters. And the last thing I'll say, just like I said yesterday, is what have the protesters in Ferguson, what have the protesters in New York, what have the protesters all over the place, all around the country been calling for since the Mike Brown situation, since the Eric Garner situation? I'll tell you, I'm part of these movements. I know better than anybody. Listen to them. They'll tell you. You want to stop pretending like you know what they think and just listen to them tell you? They'll tell you what they want. They'll tell you what they believe. Here's what they believe. They want body cameras on all the police officers. They want to change the drug war laws so that you don't have license to butt into people's business when they're not doing anything violent. They want to start having community policing. We've discussed this before. Community policing means have programs where people from a given community police their own community. Don't have an outside invading army of all white people in a predominantly black community when there's no understanding and mutual friendship between the two of them. And of course, they're calling for special prosecutors, which is a no-brainer. You can't have prosecutors who otherwise depend on the police officers turn around and the next day prosecute the police officers, which is the problem that we saw in Ferguson and the problem that we saw in the Eric Garner situation. So this is what they're calling for: special prosecutors, body cameras, changing the drug war laws, and community policing. These are very straightforward, substantive ways to change policy. But instead of addressing those concerns, what does this jackass do? He goes out there and pretends like the entire peace movement would support the actions of the crazy person, Ishmael Brinsley.